Number 17, if you'd like to follow along. They refused to obey and were not mindful of the wonders you had performed among them. But they stiffened their neck and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them.
So I want to ask you a question. How would your faith be different if you saw Jesus' miracles? Well, the simple answer is it wouldn't. So we'll go ahead and get our song 354. No, I'm just kidding. You're like, wow, Roger's going to be like 2 minutes long. What a glorious day. But the truth is, your faith wouldn't be different, even if you saw his miracles. And I got to tell you, there's been a whole lot of times, especially when I was younger, studying through the scriptures, in a class or teaching it myself, and just reading about the things Jesus did and thinking, man, I just wish I had seen that. I wish I could have been in the boat when he stopped the wind and the waves. I wish I could have been standing there when he called Lazarus to come walking out. I wish I had seen these things he had done. And I thought to myself, my faith would have been stronger. But that's really not true. And I come to that really from Jesus and God's own teachings. That we think if we saw it in person, our faith would be stronger. We think if we were like, doubting Thomas, I won't believe unless I touch, we'd all be in big trouble, right? If I couldn't touch his side and I couldn't touch the wounds, well, you and I can't touch those things, because they're not around to be touched. And I want to point out a couple of things before we even get to the Nehemiah, because it was actually read for us, one of the passages I thought about using. Mark read it, and it's actually in Matthew 27 and verse 41. The chief priests were there with Jesus was being crucified. The chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him." If he had come down from the cross, do you think they would have believed in him? I don't think so. Notice they even said it. He saved others. They were completely aware of all the things he had done. They didn't try to deny it. Some of them had even seen it. They had been around when he healed people on a Sabbath day, and they still wanted to kill him. They witnessed his miracles, and instead of believing that he was the Messiah, they wanted to kill him. Why? Because they really didn't believe in God. They believed in their religion. They believed in their religious practices. But they didn't believe God. They didn't hear God. When Jesus spoke, they weren't, "There's the voice of God." They thought, "There's the voice of the devil. There's the voice of one of the devil's ministers." They didn't hear God because they didn't believe God. They were very religious people, believed there was a God. But when God himself came, they didn't hear him, even though they saw the miracles that he did. Just like the people that Nehemiah are speaking about, talking about the people that came out of Egypt. The people that came out of Egypt saw a lot of miracles as well. Those miracles that were done in Egypt affected all the nation. They saw them. They saw the wonders. And Nehemiah said, they refused to obey and were not mindful of the wonders that you performed among them. They stiffened their neck. Even when they saw, they didn't believe. And so sometimes we think, Well, if only I saw that, if only I could experience this, then I would believe. How many times, have you ever had that time in your life when you wanted something so bad, you prayed about something, and almost gave it a condition, well, if this were to happen, then I'd really believe? Happens, people do that. Sometimes they'll pray for somebody to get well, some loved one. And if they get well, then I'll believe it. But if they don't, then I won't believe. But even if they do, very often they don't believe. Oh, no, it was just science, or it was just something else. We almost always rationalize away what we think. People are really good at that. Deciding what we want and then making an argument to prove ourselves right. And so, the people who have seen the miracles of Jesus, how many of them actually came to him? No, we know 3,000 Jews became Christians on the day of Pentecost, when the gospel by the apostles began to be preached. How many thousands of people saw his miracles, witnessed his miracles? Well, we know 5,000 people alone were fed at one time. Not even all the other miracles he did. The church grew to 5,000, just men, probably 10,000 or more people. What percentage of Israel was that? What percentage of people who witnessed his miracles was that? And I want you to understand this. This is where we're going to eventually understand in this lesson. They could not hear the voice of God in spite of all the miracles they saw. And if you really want to be Jesus' disciple, you need to hear the voice of God. Now, I don't mean you're hearing voices, him talking to you in the present tense, and, where we need to get some white coats for you. I don't mean that kind of hearing voices. But I mean the kind when for me, I'm driving down the road and people cut me off. Or, like a few days ago, we had one of those instances out on state where 2 lanes, and then, we had to merge up ahead because of some traffic cones and things. Well, one person just decided, well, I don't want anybody to be over in that lane, so I'm going to straddle both lanes. And if you go down the right-hand lane, I'm going to move in front of you. Patience. I need patience. I hear the voice of Jesus. I hear the voice of God. You need to be patient. You need to be forgiving. You need to be kind and gentle. I really do hear that. I hear scriptures in my head when I am in the middle of life, and I don't attribute them, oh, that's a scripture I've read. That's God talking to me. He has sent me these messages so that I can hear his voice. I didn't have to be on Mount Sinai to hear his voice. I hear his voice because he has sent me these letters that I may understand them. But you know what's really fascinating? I have never once ever sat there in those moments and heard the voice of some preacher. That would actually be a shame if you did. Because the purpose of somebody preaching or teaching is not for you to hear them and wonder, wow, just how great they are and how eloquent they are, but for you to understand the message God has delivered to you. Because it isn't about the teacher. It's about the message. And do you hear the message? So I want to look at a passage I want to look at here this morning. 1 Kings 19. And I'm going to read this from 9 through 13. It's probably a story that you all know. This is right after Elijah has had that great victory on Mount Carmel, where in the battle between he and the prophets of Baal, and they all kind of, who can burn up the sacrifice by praying to God and all that. And then after doing all that, they put to death all those false prophets. And then after that, Jezebel goes, I hate that Elijah guy. Let's go kill him. And Elijah's like, okay, I better run for it. And this is the Lord, or revealing himself to Elijah, because Elijah has come to a cave. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. So go stand out there. He's in a cave. I want you to go stand out there at the kind of the mouth of the cave by the mountain, or on the mountain, and he says, the Lord's going to pass by. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. Or some translations say a still, quiet voice. He's talking about a whisper. He heard a whisper. And he says, and when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Exact same question. What did he do between those two questions? Exact same question God asks him both times. He answers essentially the same both times. But in the middle of that, God teaches him where you can find him. You don't find him in the great storm, or in the earthquake, or in the fire. You find him in the whisper. When you hear his voice. He doesn't come to you banging your head with a pot or pan. He whispers to you. He calls to you. Because what happened when God actually spoke out loud to everybody to tell them what they should do? They all got so terrified they said, please don't do that anymore. That's what happened at Mount Sinai. And understand, you and I would have been just as terrified as they were. They weren't terrified just because they didn't have faith, though most of them didn't. They were terrified. We're told in Hebrews 11, even Moses was terrified. I think that's in Hebrews 11. Anyway, we are told Moses was terrified as well. Obviously, Moses was not a man of small faith, was he? But when he heard God talk directly to them from the mountain, he was terrified. And so he went up on the mountain and received the message from the Lord, that he might bring it down to them and deliver it to them. But I want to ask you, was the voice any different from what they heard on the mountain from the voice that Moses delivered to them in written word, or in the spoken word of Moses? Was the voice any different? And I want to turn to Deuteronomy in chapter 30. And I want you to understand Moses talking about the voice of God. Actually, I kind of looked this up. I just looked up the word voice just from Exodus to Deuteronomy, and Moses uses it all the time. Talks about the voice of God. Here in Deuteronomy 30, though, this is not the generation of people who actually heard at Mount Sinai. Now, some of them might have been kids under 20, but a lot of them were born after that. They never heard the literal voice of God from Mount Sinai. And he is talking to the generation 40 years after what happened at Mount Sinai. And Moses is talking to this generation of Israelites who are about to go into the land God has promised them. And he said, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, talking about going into that land, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey His voice. He was talking to these people. They were supposed to be hearing His voice. You're supposed to be hearing His voice. In all that I command you today, with all your heart, with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you. And He will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. Now, I don't know how good of speaker Moses was. I don't know if did he speak like Charlton Heston? Not in the same language, obviously. But, when you think of Moses speaking, does a lot of you still picture Charlton Heston talking? You watch that movie every year? Or maybe you think of Morgan Freeman, Voice of God, in some movie. But Moses actually said he wasn't a very good speaker. So I don't know if that just wasn't true or he got better. But here's the thing. How good a speaker Moses was doesn't matter at all in the message. Little side note. I went to high school in what was deemed, when I was in high school, about a freshman, California declared my high school that I was attending to be one of the worst in California. And so they sent us tons of money. And apparently it also got embezzled somehow. And so they could only afford to give us 5 classes a day, so we had really short days. And so they said, really the test scores were terrible at that school. And, people going on to college was really low. But I can name for you, off the top of my head, 25 or 30 really smart people who all learned really well at that school. Now, would they have learned better? Maybe so. I don't know. But they were committed to learn. We might not have had the best teachers in the state. Maybe we didn't. Wasn't necessarily the greatest. When I first got there as a freshman, there was a lot of gang battles in the south parking lot. So I went home through the north parking lot. And so there was a lot of extracurricular things that prevented people who didn't want to learn, made it really easy to not learn. But for people who wanted to learn, you could learn. Anybody ever had or known somebody that had a really great teacher and who still didn't learn anything? Because learning really isn't about the teacher. Maybe a little bit. Teacher can help a little here and there. But the reality is, learning is about the heart of the one who wants to learn and the commitment they have to learning. And when kids are little, what matters most about their learning is whether their parents value it. Because are you as a parent making sure they do their homework? Are you asking them about their schooling? Are you talking to them about those things? That matters more than who their teacher is. That matters more than how good and whether the teacher had laser light shows or not. Those things don't really impact learning that much. And all through this passage, he's telling them, and Moses isn't going to be with them much longer. He says, you've got to hear the voice. You've got to obey the voice that I have delivered to you. says, Lord's going to bring you into the land your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. Lord your God will circumcise your heart, the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. And the Lord your God will put all these curses on your foes, enemies who persecute you, and you shall again obey the voice of the Lord and keep all his commandments that I command you today. Moses was helping them see that what he was teaching them was not the words and wisdom of Moses, but the voice of God. And I know, for me as somebody trying to teach the Word of God, I am always a little concerned that how I teach somehow becomes more about me teaching than about the message that's being delivered. And I don't want that to ever happen. I want us to really be able to hear the voice of God and not the voice of some man or person. But how many people really do revere teachers and preachers more than God? Now, they don't say they do, right? People don't usually, put on pedestals, right? Preachers. Well, it happens all the time, doesn't it? There's a reason we call a school of thought Calvinism, because somebody heaped up somebody's teaching above others. And it's not unusual, it's normal. People do it all the time. They elevate certain people. They elevate speakers. I remember years ago, I was almost a new Christian, and I actually went to a meeting and heard a speaker talking about, I don't remember what this meeting was about, the theme of it or anything. I do remember a couple of stories that he told, but what was interesting, what really fascinated me, was the guy was a magnificent speaker. And I had actually heard that. He was renowned and known to be a magnificent speaker. I was in California, he was from Florida, and it's like, wow, I'm going here. And I left the lesson, wow, yeah, what a great speaker. And the guy I was with, he said, yeah, I mean, we're talking less than 10 minutes after it's over. We're driving home, and he's like, oh yeah, what was the lesson about? What passages do you remember? What teaching do you remember? And I couldn't remember any of it. I could repeat to you stories about his 50s car and a girlfriend he had when he was a teenager. 10 minutes after his lesson, I couldn't tell you the scriptural point he was making. Now, I'm fully aware that a week from now you won't remember what I preached today. The reality is I won't remember either. I have to go look it up sometime. What did I preach last week? But I do hope 5 or 10 minutes after you actually know what I was talking about scripturally. The idea, the scriptural concept that God is trying to get us to understand. Because I'm not that interested in, I want to communicate well, but I'm not that interested in being renowned for speaking. I hope you can hear the voice of God. Now, we actually looked at this Wednesday. And I want you to turn with me to Luke. This is actually a pretty interesting passage. I actually asked, and you can ask the people in the class, I asked everybody and listened to everybody say what they thought the main point of the story of the rich man and Lazarus is. And then I told them what I think it is. I think I'm in the wrong chapter there. It should be chapter 16 and verse 19, not 17. So in Luke 16, starting in verse 19, we get the story of the rich man and Lazarus. The word Lazarus, the name Lazarus means lover of God. Okay? And we have a rich man. That's pretty self-explanatory. Let me just read the story. It says, there was a rich man who was clothed in purple. By the way, purple was incredibly expensive. to have purple clothing because the only way they got purple came from a dye from a shellfish that divers had to dive into this ocean to get out of the bases of the ocean. And in Philippi, by the way, the woman Lydia actually ran a part of this business. That's why she was wealthy. But they would dive down, they would get this little shellfish, and they would get a drop. I mean, out of each one, a tiny drop of this thing they would use to dye clothing with. And it took hundreds to dye like one person's, outfit. And so it was only worn by usually the most wealthy people who could afford to have this purple clothing. And that's what he's referring to here. He's showing you how wealthy he was by talking about being clothed in purple. And fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day. The image here is a big fat guy. Right? You eat sumptuously every day, what happens to your weight? I'm aware. Tends to go up. And he said, and at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and he saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. So the rich man sees Lazarus with Abraham being comforted, and he himself is in torment. And so he calls out and he says, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. So God has fixed it so that people are separated when we die, he says in this story. And so he's looking over there and he's just going, I'm in such agony here, and he's being comforted. And so the rich man then says, when he realizes he can't be comforted, he says, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. Now in this story, there's a lot to the story, by the way. We get this idea of what happens to us after dying. There's, all of the lessons about being the rich man or being the poor man. And sometimes we can look at the character of each. We can look at the behavior of each. We can understand a little bit about what happens after we die. At least, we think we can grasp some of what Jesus is teaching us about that. And so on Wednesday, I'd ask everybody, what do you think the main lesson of this is? And we're talking about the rich man, we're talking about the poor man, we're talking all kinds of stuff, right? All kinds of things that we do think about, and yet it's not the conclusion that Jesus himself really made in the story. And so, because Abraham said to him when he said, send somebody to go tell them, because they don't want to come here. I don't want them to come here. And so Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. He said, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to him, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Now, Jesus is going to rise from the dead in the not too distant future. How many of the people who didn't believe him when he spoke about Moses and the prophets and fulfilling those things didn't believe him after he rose from the dead? It didn't change. And we talked about it a little bit Wednesday, and I made this what I think is really the central point Jesus is trying to get us to see. If we won't hear the prophets that have been written down for us, We're not going to hear one who comes right to our face and does some miracle. We think we would. We'd like to think that, oh, we'll listen when something big happens. He says that won't happen. They're not going to listen when some big grand event happens. If they won't listen to Obadiah or Jeremiah, Habakkuk, right? Isaiah, Matthew, Mark, Luke. We think that we would be more faithful if we only had better preacher. We'd be more faithful if we only had a better teacher. We'd be more faithful if we were more faithful. That's why our faith is us. And we're not going to be more faithful because of events. We're either going to trust God or we're not going to trust God. And the events that happen and the power of those events do not determine how much faith you're going to have. You're not going to become more faithful if we had a big stand up here and a big band and we had a laser light show and people are playing music and singing religious songs to that music. Now, lots of churches have believed that. In fact, one of the churches that started this kind of mega church movements with lots of, bells and whistles and just every kind of program you could imagine. They, after doing it for 20 or 30 years, actually is in the suburbs of Chicago. And they, after looking at it, they kind of reviewed it for the last 25, 30 years. They did this about 10 years ago. They realized they really hadn't converted anybody. All they had done is put programs on for single people with a child and single people and with. They had done all kinds of programs. They'd done all kinds of events. And what they had was a lot of people who liked events. And they realized we really hadn't converted anybody to Christ. Now, I think that's actually quite amazing. They admitted it. But I was actually listening on the radio one time years ago. I was driving back from Coeur d'Alene after our brother Don had passed away, far too young. And so just to stay awake, I was listening to a radio, and it was a guy preaching from some church in Florida. And they had big bands, and they had all the stuff. And one of those churches where the word worship usually only means one thing, and it means music. And he was talking about worship. And he says, in his opinion, the congregation where he was at, we're worshiping worship, he said. We have gotten so used to worshiping worship that we're struggling to worship God. That was somebody who was doing it, who recognized the failings of what they were doing. It wasn't about God. It was about people. And people wanting to be impressed. And people wanting shows and events and things that motivate them and encourage. Because they keep thinking, if other people really motivate me, then I'll be motivated. But it's really not how motivation works. People can say everything and do all kinds of stuff, but if you don't internalize the motivation, then it won't matter. The point of rich man and Lazarus was, if they don't listen to the prophets, they're not going to listen if we send one of your brothers. Oh, maybe for a little while it'll have an effect, right? You ever had that where something happens to you and you're kind of, wow, things happen to people sometimes and they get kind of stirred up to make a change. How long do the changes last? How often do you make a change that doesn't stick? You just have kind of a short period of motivation and then it wanes and you go back to doing what you were doing before. That's what happens to people. That's not new, it's not unusual. That's normal. This is why it's so important. And I talked about hearing the voice of God. We're going to end in this. John 10, verse 16, Jesus said this. He says, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. And he's talking about Gentiles because he was talking to Jews. He says, I've got more. They're not from this fold of sheep. They're from the other fold of sheep. All those Gentiles out there. He says, I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. Do you hear Jesus speak? When he called you one of his flock, are you one of his sheep? Do you hear him? When the prophets, when Paul or Peter or John or Mark or Luke, when they write these things that Jesus said, do you hear Jesus? Or do you hear Paul and Peter and Mark? When they tell you the commandments that God said to you, what do you hear? Do you hear, hopefully not me, I'm not nearly qualified or eloquent enough worthy of that. You need to hear his voice. And we need it with us all the time. That's what Jesus said. If you're one of his sheep, you will hear his voice. You will be part of that one flock and have that one shepherd. And you will have great faith, even like a little teeny mustard seed.